Welcome back to the monthly edition of the PigX podcast. I'm your host, Delaney Howell. Today, we're diving into barn filtration, both the challenges and the opportunities. And today's guest makes the conversation lively, practical, and full of takeaways folks working in the swine industry can put into action. Joining us today is Dr. Brett Ramirez, an associate professor at Iowa State University and no stranger to the PigX podcast. He will share insights on building design considerations from air pressure and wind effects to how simply observing the weather outside is just as important as what goes into the structure itself. Plus, we'll talk about the value of assembling the right team when tackling filtration projects. Dr. Ramirez brings a strong background in swine and poultry housing, with research spanning ventilation and energy efficiency. He is especially passionate about barn filtration and recently presented on the topic at this year's Iowa Swine Day. Let's kick things off by hearing why he believes this is such a hot topic for folks working in the swine industry today.
I think it's a lot of different factors go into it. PRRS right now is pretty devastating, and biosecurity is on the top of a lot of people's minds. And I think when we get down to filtered sow farms, there's a lot of money invested in them, and it's really important that we keep these farms operating smoothly, efficiently, and doing the best thing we can to really minimize that risk of PRRS transmission into those farms.
So Brett, share with our listeners, what is a pressure barn system? Let's start there.
So there's two types of filtered farms. There's a negative pressure filtered farm and there's a positive pressure filtered farm. Negative pressure filtered farms are like a traditional ventilation system where we pull air in from the outside, pull it through the filters, through the pad, through the inlets or through tunnel, however it is, and then the fans exhaust it at the end. And so this is a very common way. It's a traditional way. It's set up very similar to how we normally operate ventilation systems. And so it's a little bit, I think from a management perspective, it's a little bit easier because most people are familiar with how negative pressure systems work. And so with this, all we're doing is adding filters in it, but it operates very similar to how a traditional barn would operate. Positive pressure is the opposite. So here we're going to probably pull air through a pad or a filter, then it's going to go into a very well-sealed area, and then the fans are going to push that clean air into the attic, which is then going to push it down through the inlets and then pushed out through some exhaust opening that's distributed along the length of the walls. And so here, the big difference is that in a negative pressure system, the barn has to be extremely tight because we have to minimize any leakage, because any leaks that come in through a negative pressure system are going to be dirty air. Versus with positive pressure, we're pushing that air in and that air is leaking out, reducing that risk of dirty air infiltrating the barn and reducing the risk of disease transmission.
Is there a way to determine if a negative or positive pressure system works best for a producer?
It's personal preference and really what works for your system. I know some have a mixture of both types in the system. Some only have one type, some only have the other. It just all kind of depends on how your system operates and what's comfortable for you.
So you mentioned filtration only works if we don't drag disease in through other vectors. What does that mean in practical day-to-day barn operations?
Yeah, so I'm by no means a biosecurity expert and disease transmission, but when we think about filtration, I usually put it as kind of that last part of a full biosecurity plan because it is by far probably one of the most expensive, challenging things to implement, and we really have to do all the little things right before we get to that filtration part, right? We can invest in filtration, but if we skip the small things like Danish entry, boot covers, showers, D&D rooms, all those washes, all those things that go into a comprehensive biosecurity plan, have to be in place for filtration to be successful and effective as part of the whole plan. So yeah, what I mean is, filtration is expensive and it's challenging. It's once you put it in is something that you do have to deal with 24/7, right? It's ventilation. It's always got to be running, always has to be managed. And so we really want to make sure we do the little things right before we get to filtration as part of that plan.
And then maybe one other question just to set up some context here for your overall presentation. In your view, how far has the industry come in terms of filtration design and implementation since the early 2000s?
It's come a long way. I think I see different designs at every farm I go to. I think it's improving. I think there's a lot of things we still have to work on that we haven't quite figured out yet. And that's kind of what I was touching on a little bit in the presentation. But I think vastly improved from those early 2000s, whether it's positive or negative pressure. I think we're doing a better job understanding the constraints and challenges and what we need to do to overcome those, and how do we get a well operating system that not only is effective as part of the biosecurity plan, but also providing a good environment for those pigs.
Awesome. So, Brett, as you think then about ventilation, what are some of the common mistakes that you see or pressures that you see when it comes to how barns are engineered for filtration?
So I think there's a few. I think we always have to remember, and you said it, pressure. Static pressure is additive. Every point in the system as you go through it, from cool cell, filters, inlets, the room, the exhaust, or if you're in a negative pressure, the soffit, attic, wall, what tunnel, whatever it is, static pressure is additive, and we have to be cognizant of that, and we have to account for it. We can't spec fans at a 0.1 static pressure and expect that barn to ventilate well. It's just not going to happen. There's an enormous amount of static pressure that has to be accounted for when we spec those fans, because we need to achieve the correct ventilation rate at the end of the day. Because again, part of biosecurity, but also part of, we have to provide a good environment to keep those sows performing. So static pressure is additive, and we can't forget that, and we need to respect it and make sure we're sizing fans correctly. One of the other ones is, I'd say, air distribution. I think especially in some of these very large positive pressure barns, we really struggle with getting good air distribution in both summer and winter. There's an enormous amount of ceiling inlets in these farms, and getting that air distributed throughout that whole farm becomes a challenge. Even though we think the attic is, at a constant pressure, a large plenum, it just doesn't flow quite, I think, the way we think. And so making sure we're keeping that in mind, and if we need to add stir fans or we need to close inlets in winter, have to be aware that there's going to need to pay attention to that air distribution to make sure that environment across the whole room volume is comfortable for the sows.
So then looking at static pressure and airflow resistance, how do producers balance filtration effectiveness with fan efficiency?
So when we're specing fans and trying to determine our ventilation rates, it's just critical that we pick a static pressure, usually above about a 0.25, to make sure we're getting the airflow we need for a good air exchange rate inside those barns. And so, different filters, different pads, they all have different static pressure losses through them. And so it's just important that we understand how each of these components in the system are going to contribute to that overall static pressure that our fans are going to have to ultimately operate against. Because again, we need to provide a good environment in that barn at the end of the day, and we don't want that environment to suffer because we didn't quite size these fans correctly, knowing that these filters and pads and inlets all are going to contribute to that total static pressure.
Talk to me a little bit too about filter ratings. What are they and why should we consider them?
Yeah, so all filters are rated on the MERV scale, which is the minimum efficiency reporting value. This is done in labs, and they assign these filters. And what this does is tells you the percent capture of particulate matter as it goes through a filter. And so you can look it up, Google it. There's a MERV rating scale, and so this goes from 1 to 20. And then they break it down into 3 categories, where air filters will trap particle size from 0.3 to 1 micron, 1 to 3 microns, and 3 to 10 microns. And so then you'll see a percentage in this chart that shows you what fraction of those particles are going to get trapped. And as that MERV rating increases, the better it is at trapping particles in these different size ranges. So typically what we see on sow farms is somewhere between a MERV 14 and 16. I'd say most have transitioned to at least a 15 to 16, especially if they're in a high pressure area. Because like a MERV 16 filter, for example, is going to be 95% or better at trapping zero point 0.3 to 3 microns. And so that's how we're trying to really, we're assuming that virus is attached to particulate matter or dust in the air. So what we want to do is remove that dust with that virus from getting inside our barn.
That was really helpful. I understood it really well. So thanks for breaking it down like that, Brett.
Yeah, so
Um,
when you get home, you'll have to check what MERV rating you have on your furnace filter.
I know I was just thinking I could do that.
Yep.
So what MERV rating should the average barn go for? Is it just again personal preference, or is there kind of a standard threshold we should be looking to attain?
Well, so most are going to have a primary and a secondary filter. The primary filter is what we commonly call as a pre-filter, which is very similar to what is on your furnace at home. And this is going to typically have around about a MERV 8 rating. And so what that one is for is to catch the bigger particles and prevent them from eventually clogging your much more expensive secondary filter. And so really it does come down to disease pressure. Again, I've seen anywhere between a 14 and 16. I'd say we're trending towards a higher MERV value, especially here in Iowa where it's pretty high pressure. So I'd say a lot of farms are at a MERV 16, but you still see some with, MERV 14s and 15s.
So in essence, are these filters just literally capturing dust, particles, disease, pressure, etc. in within the filter?
Yeah, so there's different mechanisms on how filters trap those particles. I'm not going to get into all those mechanics, but literally they are just trapping dust. They are trapping it and preventing it from going into the barn.
So then as we think about environmental challenges, there are a lot of considerations to take into account there, wind being one of those. What are some different strategies producers can use to mitigate impacts related to wind when it comes to ventilation?
Yeah, so wind is a huge challenge, especially here in the upper Midwest. And I mean, we're all familiar with it. It's not new to know that it's windy out here. What makes it hard is that the wind comes from all different directions. We have prevailing winds in the different seasons, but we really have to protect ourselves from really backdrafting from all these different angles. And so it's a really complicated scenario of how do we prevent backdrafting, especially more targeted towards positive pressure barns. How do we prevent that wind from pushing outside dirty air through our exhaust openings and then potentially leading to disease transmission? So what a lot of people have done, and there's still a lot of ongoing work on trying to find the best, designs and solutions, just because it is so complicated and dynamic. The use of windbreaks, surrounding these exhaust openings, is really critical, and we're still trying to figure out what is the best option and how do we really minimize that risk of backdrafting on these positive pressure farms, because we want to protect that investment at the end of the day. And so we're looking into research and doing a lot, working with cooperators on trying to figure out a good solution that hopefully we can share with everybody.
Any early findings that you want to share from your study?
It's complicated.
Okay.
That's all. That's all I'll say is we're just diving into it now, and it is really quite complicated.
Thanks for sharing that glimpse. Another topic we wanted to discuss today is improving control logic on farms. First, let's start with what does that mean?
Yeah. So what it means is, we're in a technology era, and we put a lot of faith and we like technology, and we think it's going to solve a lot of our solutions. In a barn, I think there's a lot of opportunities for technology, but when it comes to control, we have to remember that that controller is ultimately going to operate the way it's programmed, but it's going to rely on the settings from the user to make those decisions. And so what I'm getting at is if the settings are wrong that the human programs it to do, that could lead to a bad environment. Excessive energy usage can create problems. If the equipment doesn't work in the barn, if your heater doesn't work, you have fans out, you have inlets stuck, the controller can't do anything about that, and you're still going to get potentially a bad environment. So the controller can't do it. And again, a human has to be there fixing things. If the facility was poorly designed, we don't have the right equipment size, we didn't account for static pressure, again, the environment might suffer. Sensors not accurate, if they're not in the right spot, the controller is just going to take that information regardless of knowing that they're not in the right spot because the human put those sensors in the wrong spot. And so it's just going to control based off the information it receives. So we really have to pay attention to the human aspect in the training and the education that goes into when we're putting settings into a controller so that we make sure we set us up for the best chance of success. And we're not constantly changing things, or, as we have turnover, we're not getting different opinions. And we always need to know, what was the original settings and what was the original concept, and not after iterations of, turnover, that we're at something new that's just completely wrong or erroneous, and that we're not getting exactly what we want inside these barns. So yeah, line is, it doesn't matter how expensive, how, high tech that controller is. We really need trained, informed people making the decisions when they go and put those settings into the controller.
And layout, it looks like, is also a big consideration to make when you think about wind, backdraft, inlet air speeds, dead spots, all of these considerations. How do you think about layout, especially given cold weather, tight layouts, all of those things? How do you take all those things into consideration for layout as well?
Yeah, you try to do the best that you can, because you also got to consider, pen layout, locations, and a lot of times it ends up just being having like doing even spacing on inlets. Some have messed around with different spacing, trying to get that flow to be a little bit more uniform across the space. And then sometimes you just have to use stir fans or some mechanical mixing just to help improve that. And so I usually like to kind of plot out, what does it look like, usually in like a positive pressure, for example, there's so many inlets that maybe layout doesn't matter so much because they're so close together, you're going to get air everywhere. Versus maybe a negative pressure where there's not so many inlets. We want to make sure that we're, not too far away. We don't have inlets too close to each other. So we don't get air crashing into it and then falling down. And we just got to kind of plan and look at what that spread of air is across the floor.
Brett, what's maybe some guidance for producers or folks working in the swine industry when it comes to troubleshooting poor barn environments?
Yeah, so I break it down into, is it a distribution problem, or is it a air exchange problem, or is it both? Um, Sometimes it's one or the other, sometimes it's a combination, and then it gets a little more complicated. But I first start with, am I trying to solve a distribution problem, or am I trying to solve a ventilation problem? So each one comes with different avenues to take. And then if it's both, you kind of got to look at the whole picture and do a little bit more dissecting on what the issue might be. But, if it's a distribution problem, we need to be checking airspeed at the inlets, static pressure, restrictions. Is there something in there that's causing that distribution not to be quite so good? Ventilation problem is, also somewhat related, but, is this, dirty fans, loose belts? Is it something where we're not getting the exchange rate? Are we getting too many high gas levels in winter? Is it the barn temperature lift from inlet to outlet too high? Then we're looking in, maybe there's a restriction, fan's not working, something of that nature. Then if it's both, we go through the whole thing and try to figure it out. So first step of troubleshooting, usually with me, is understand what's going on outside, be aware of the temperature, humidity, the wind, when you get to the barn, because whatever is happening outside is going to directly affect what's happening inside. So set yourself for the weather, even though, if you go into a sow farm, you lose all track of sense of direction, time, and what's going on, but try to have an idea of what's outside, because it's going to affect what's inside. And then after that, you start breaking it down from distribution, ventilation, combination, and just kind of start walking through. And really, at the end of the day, you got to follow the entire path of the air from outside, inside, then back outside. So you need to understand where all that air goes and then look at every step of that process.
What's one thing most producers overlook when they install or upgrade filtration systems?
Ooh, that's a good one. I'd say probably just static pressure and sizing of the number of filters, the amount of evaporative pad, the amount of inlets. and barn tightness. Whether it's positive or negative pressure, these barns have to be constructed extremely tight. Negative pressure, obviously, we don't want leaks coming in. Positive pressure, we don't want leaks going out too much, because if there's big leaks, then that air is not going to our pigs. So both barns have to be constructed extremely tight. Then we really just need to make sure that we get proper sizing on everything to really minimize those restrictions, and just reduce that static pressure that those fans are going to have to work against.
Next one I had was for producers with limited capital. What are the top 1 to 2 investments you'd recommend to improve barn air quality or disease filtration?
Yeah, it's a loaded question. So I guess I would approach it from, depending if there's issues. Probably a good investment would be in newer fans with much higher airflow ratios than older fans. These fans are going to perform a lot better at these higher static pressures. And so if somebody has old fans, I think it's worth exploring newer fans with better airflow ratios, just again, to keep that environment going. And I think the other one is, just if you're short on opening and you're having issues, it's worth, if you can increase evaporative pad area. Filter area is very hard to increase after the fact, but just making sure we have adequate openings to, again, like I said in the last question, anything to reduce the amount of static pressure those fans have to work against.
How should producers think about future proofing their barns when it comes to ventilation design for the next 10 years?
I think is just making sure we get the right air exchange rates. We have to, respect the prolific sow of today. They're producing a lot more heat. There's more piglets. And we have to make sure we're designing to account for this much higher heat and moisture production of these pigs. And so if you shortchange yourself now on air exchange rate, it's just that's just going to amplify over time, because it's only, it's an increasing trend. So just getting enough fan capacity in these barns, I think, is critical. And then considering, the way climate is going in different directions, and the extremes that we're seeing is, do you start to explore other options that are going to kind of set you up for success? If we are experiencing more humidity, higher temperatures, anything in there that it might be worth exploring some different options in the future.
From design elements for a swine building to the bigger picture with practical advice. We'd like to thank Dr. Brett Ramirez for joining us on today's podcast to share his perspective on barn filtration. For more details, including his full presentation from this year's Iowa Swine Day, visit the Iowa Pork Industry Center's YouTube channel and look for the session titled Iowa Swine Day 2025, Under Pressure, Barn Filtration Challenges and Opportunities. Today's episode was jam-packed with insights, and we appreciate all of you tuning in with us until the end. Be sure to join us next month for another timely topic on all things swine. Until then, I'm Delaney Howell, and this has been the PigX Podcast.
PigX is a national podcast hosted by the Pig Livability Project partners at Iowa State University, Kansas State University, and Purdue, and supported by the Iowa Pork Industry Center. For more information on the project, head to www.piglivability.org, or to inquire directly with questions regarding the project, email ipic.iastate.edu. PigX, ideas in the swine industry worth sharing.